Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashalieva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any question for our guest. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Hello, everyone, and I'm glad to welcome back our contributor, Dr. Mark Thomas from Salle University in Philadelphia, who will talk to us about the current progress on creating just and enduring peace between Ukraine and Russia. Dr. Thomas is an expert on political science. He earned his PhD from University of Notre Dame, and he has an MBA from American Graduate School of International Management. Before returning to academia, Dr. Thomas worked for many years in the Balkans, Afghanistan, and other countries in Europe and Central Asia. Please, Dr. Thomas, welcome back to MUkraine. Microphone is yours.
Good afternoon, Victor. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening for those of you who are in Ukraine. Slava. Any case, hey, I'm very happy to be back, and it's always an honor to be here with MUkraine. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about what it would look like if there was a possibility for a just and lasting peace between Russia and Ukraine. And before we start down that route, I want to talk about what I mean by just peace. It's popularly called in peace and conflict resolution studies a positive peace, which means there's three broad areas briefly of what peaceful relations should look like. One naturally being political, the third being economic, and then the other one being social. In order to get to a positive peace, all three elements have to be addressed. So both the political cause of friction, so what elite leaders want, what would economic relations both within a country and between two countries look like? And then third, what would the social conditions look like? And in social conditions, we throw things like political myths or history, or ethnic rivalries, which are a product partially of history, but I always believe they're more a function of really elite leaders trying to aggravate existing situations. Now, with that said, as I've been looking at interethnic relations over the especially past 2 weeks, looking at what's going on in the Balkans, I'm coming more and more to believe, I think the evidence points that direction, that disputes within a group of people, between two ethnic groups, or for that matter, between two countries, as I'm thinking further about this, is a matter of when one power or one group of people either seek to gain dominance or already gaining dominance politically. Two, when they're geographically contingent. And then three, when there is some ethnic myth which causes an us versus them situation. But those three conditions being present doesn't mean that war will break out. What makes it possible ultimately is what the elite leaders want, or an elite leader. In this case, we can say, when we look, if it wouldn't be for a autocratic Russia run by somebody who wants to become the next Stalin, or the next Stalin, like Putin, you'll see war develop very quickly. So what would it take to get to a positive peace? So that means no fighting whatsoever. People are satisfied with the end result of whatever negotiations occur. So what would it take for nobody to be upset with how this ends? And ultimately, we'll say there'll always be differences between two groups of people, between two countries. For that matter, and leave out the current era, we may not always disagree with the Canadians about what trade should look like or what border control should look like. So there's always some degree of tension. Well, how do we get to a point where the tensions between Russia and Ukraine are nothing more than differences between, say, Germany and Poland currently, which, by the way, they have a long history of not liking each other. And there's a history of change of borders, of change of peoples within the borders. And we have to ask, why do we have peace between Poland and Germany, or for that matter, between Poland and the Czech Republic? Because as memory serves, one of the hidden parts of the Munich Agreement was Poland got a northern section of what was then part of the Czechoslovakia. So why is there not fighting between them? Well, there's some conditions that have to be met. So what would it take right now for there to be peace between, Russia and Ukraine? If people could sit at the table and say, we will trade these things. Well, what are the heart of the disputes? At the heart of the dispute, we can go back to the fact that Ukraine has leaned very much towards the West, both economically and militarily. Secondly, when Ukraine started moving westward, we see Russia seizing the Donbass, initially Crimea, and claiming that as sovereign territory. And then we have the invasion that comes in 2022, which we're now in the fourth year of the war, and Ukraine has fought back vigorously. So we have a series of things that we have to think about what would bring back a peace where the Ukrainians are satisfied and the Russians are satisfied. And really, to say the Russians, we mean Vladimir Putin. So how do we bring all of the conditions together? Well, if we think about the geographic borders, what would Russia be willing to give back or give up in terms of territory that they've seized since really since 2014, when Russia broke the 1991 borders. 1991 borders being Crimea was part of Ukraine. The Donbass was still part of Ukraine, or actually still is by most international agreements. It's still part of Ukraine. A few have recognized the Donbass and Luhansk republics. So what would it take geographically for the Ukrainians and Russians to be happy and not resort to continued fighting? And then the other part, what would Ukraine's international relations look like? Would Ukraine align to the Eurasian Union, essentially the Russian version of the European Union, which involves many Central Asian countries and a handful of countries along Russia's immediate periphery, including Belarus? Or could Ukraine possibly align with the EU and Russia not be upset? And then in terms of military alliances, what should Ukraine look like militarily? Could it have enough forces to maintain self-sufficient and self-defense? Is it possible for it to align with the European Union's defenses? Would it be possible for it to align with NATO? Could it go back to the old Ukraine-NATO dialogue without threatening Russia? Those are some of the larger conditions. So if we were to go down and say, let's look at, and then internally politically, would Russia be happy if Ukraine kept a democratic government? And if had a democratic elected government, would Russia demand that it have influence over Ukrainian politics, be it foreign affairs or over how things are run domestically, or both. So there's several conditions you'd have to think about. What would the Russians need to be happy not to continue fighting? Then likewise, what would the Ukrainians need not to continue resisting, and to give up? So say, hypothetically, all the war stops, and Russian forces pull back, but they don't pull back all the way. They leave some in the Donbass region. Would you have essentially returned back to the forest fighters of the late 1940s or resistance fighters from Ukraine who would still cause sabotage? So there's this broad idea or scheme of how can we get to a peace? So, looking at it objectively and going through Russian official statements. If we go by the idea that, excuse me 1 second, if we go by the fact that it's highly unlikely that Russia will ever give up Crimea, is Ukraine willing to accept that condition? Now, then second, we look at Donbass and the Donbass region. Is Russia willing to pull out of the Donbass in exchange for Ukraine saying we will never join NATO, or we will never align with the European Union? That's a very interesting question to think about. That what would Ukraine trade in exchange to get back the Donbass? Would it give up aligning with NATO? Would it give up aligning with the European Union? Likewise, is there a middle zone that Russia could say, okay, we'll give back the Donbass. You can orient trade towards the European Union, but you cannot align by any way militarily with Europe or with Europe, the combination of Europe and US together in NATO. So you're getting to a very, we're now looking at the quasi zones. What's possible to give up on one side, because Russia had some very hard lines going into negotiations in the past. And if we say those is they're going in position, like you're going into a business deal, where are they willing to waver on those conditions, just end the fighting? Because over the past few months, Russia too has suffered from, I think we're talking about before the broadcast began, about Moscow burning. And I heard that during the summit up in St. Petersburg, Ukraine managed to hit a few sites in St. Petersburg, which, despite not liking how the Russian government is, I felt very near and dear to my heart, because having lived in St. Petersburg back when it was Leningrad, I kept praying that nothing of historical value got hit by the drone attacks. So if we looked now briefly at the military piece of it and kind of the economic piece. What about the issue of what could we do with in terms of the ethnic myth? The ethnic myth being what defines a Ukrainian from a Russian, and what says if I'm Ukrainian, I can't like a Russian, or if I'm a Russian, I can't like Ukraine, or Ukraine needs to be part of Russia because, ultimately Ukrainians are nothing but little Russians. And they were really part of us, or they're just that Ukrainian's just a dialect. Now, over the week at the conference in DC, we were talking about how Putin has taken these images from the past and weaponized them in such a way that we've seen in previous periods, but he's doing it more in a way of kind of rebuilding that Soviet empire. And it's to really get to, one, influence internal Russians to mobilize behind them and say, hey, these Ukrainians are nothing more than your brothers who speak a dialect. Their culture is not really different. Two, it's also to try to shape the future of how the West views as what negotiations should look like. And then three, it's to reinforce, and this is kind of disturbing, reinforce how we as Westerners understand Ukraine. One of the bitter ironies of the war in Ukraine right now is that now most people in the world, Americans included, now know where Ukraine is and have learned more about what Ukraine is. I'd say prior to the war, you could find maybe 10% of the American public able to find Ukraine on a map, or even they'll say anything what Ukrainians were. Up until that point, though, Ukraine was kind of like a sidestep. It's like how we think about Belarus now. Oh, it's just part of Russia. We're not going to worry about it. Russians have it under control. There's not that big a difference between them. And when you read the history books, with the rare exception of a few, which were always kind of ostracized in academia as being, oh, they're just extremists. When we talked about Ukraine, it was just an overview of about Russia. Anybody who spoke differently and said that Ukraine was separate, they were just a nationalist, and it wasn't really academically, I would say, academically acceptable to consider it. So part of what has to get done is in dissuading Americans, or let's say persuading Americans, that Ukraine's more than just an adjunct to Russia and that Putin's claims aren't legitimate. And that on our part, and I think MUkraine's doing a great job of showing that Ukraine actually is a nation and it has the right to sovereignty and statehood, which is actually a very easy argument to make. If we say that we recognized borders in 1991, and we can even go back to 1945, and then 1953, I believe, is when Khrushchev annexed Crimea to Ukraine. We could say that those borders are legit. And then more importantly, I always say we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of American independence. One of the legacies of that war for independence is that we claim the people, the people as a group, we as Americans of 13 colonies said, hey, one, we don't want the king, but two, we have the right as the people to say we don't want a king. We want something different. So that revolution, the American Revolution, prompted the idea of popular sovereignty in the modern era. So two things we take out of this is how do we really, that once Ukrainian statehood or borders are internationally recognized as of 1991 at the least. It could go back even further. And then two, it's not the decisions of outsiders, be it Putin or anybody else, to say that Ukraine should be part of the Soviet Union or part of Russia. Boy, there's a Freudian slip. That Ukrainians only have that right, which is recognized with all the other peoples of the world. Which not so ironically, but you get to use your ideas when you want to. Russia, for example, claims that Kosovo should be part of Serbia again, because Serbians still claim Kosovo as their own. Victor, I think I've come to the end of just my thoughts. If we want to raise some questions, maybe I can elucidate further or procrastinate further as we have.
There are so many questions and points to discuss. I don't even know what to start with. I was listening with fascination your academic approach and constantly replacing in my mind Putin with Hitler, Ukraine with France or whatever's your choice from 1939, and asking ourselves, I understand that we are addressing American academia, or let's say an average student who really may not have seen a map, but general question is, are we now changing our concept and perspectives of international relationships? Are we indeed now in the world where might means right, or at least strengths can achieve some kind of what we call peace today, but that has no guarantees? You didn't mention Budapest Memorandum of '93. You didn't mention even dissolution of Soviet Union, which I assume was somehow tacitly accepted by the world as existence of 15 independent states with different independent governments. And I liked your analogy. To be on positive side, I always tell my American friends that we are looking at 13 colonies gaining independence, and the language or ethnic issue is the last one you discuss here, because I mean, in 18th century, this was a rather unique experiment, right? But we had other, what we see now is in case of Russian Federation, is amazing devolution, if I may say, into pre-18th century mentality, pre-Enlightenment mentality, indeed to the times of ancient empires, where it was natural to attack the weaker neighbor if you didn't like their borders. And there is a term, whataboutism. So when I talk to many Russians, I tell you one anecdote. Back in 2015, I had my classmate visiting from Siberia, no names, and we were talking to friends, and they asked, what do you think about Crimea aggression, annexation? And they compared, this guy compared Crimea annexation. They have a formula: restoration of historical justice. And I never heard this before, because all the points that you mentioned are non-existent for an American perspective. It's like give Florida back to Spain, not even talking about Los Alamos and Alaska. There's still myth in Russia that Alaska was not sold under agreement of 1860s, but leased for 100 years, and now they want to take it back. So these myths that you mentioned are feeding modern aggression and violation of international rights. So I return, I can talk like this for a long time, but my question, if I may, is how do we even start balancing these interests that you mentioned, rather than like business interests? You use strange phrase, how do you make people happy?
Right.
I know it's figure of speech, but can we use more legal terminology? Because we are not here. Probably we cannot make people happy. For their happiness, Russian government has to be changed, for example, as one of the points, to more to people who will agree to be happy with other things. So my question is how all this is even possible to start achieving, and is it for us, or it's just theoretical framework for future generations, something we haven't seen in Korea, or have seen in Vietnam, or have seen in Germany?
Yeah, Victor, it's a great question. You brought up two others. I wrote them down so I can come back to them.
Yeah.
I think, what do we accept as the international values of what makes a state? One is the people of that region have said, we want to be sovereign from everybody else. Two, it's recognized by other countries as being a sovereign state. And we could argue that we did that in well, we recognized Ukraine's current borders officially 1991 when it broke from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union dissolved. We recognized again, you rightly said, in the Bucharest Memorandum of like 1997, I believe, or 98. No,
93
Bucharest,
Budapest.
93, yeah, 93. We recognized it again there when Ukraine, in exchange for giving up their nuclear weapons, Russia and the US and Great Britain said, hey, we will protect you from a future aggression. So the principles that we have legal, internationally recognized borders, the people want to be sovereign, are two conditions. The third condition is kind of inherent in the Westphalian principles, is that you don't interfere in other countries' internal affairs. The corollary to that, or maybe even the assumption, is that there is respect for the values and norms. And really, as signatories to the UN Charter, we've agreed, and the Russians too have agreed, we will respect international borders at this point. If a country says they want to be sovereign, they have the right to self-determination, they have the right to their own sovereignty. They're internationally recognized. The issue being, when a leader doesn't recognize the rule of law or respect for the rule of law is one of the things they need to abide by, the whole thing starts to fall apart. Now, I'm not going to point my finger directly at Putin. Putin's at fault. But I will just as easily point my finger at Bush II for going into Iraq without UN authorization. Although I've seen stuff saying that it was authorized, or into Kosovo, although I've seen it was authorized by Clinton, by the UN Security Council in '99. Russians viewed it differently. When you break the norms, you open up essentially a barrel of worms. And if I can mix metaphors, the worms always turn. So what works for the goose works well for the gander as well. There is this problem when you break the norms. So that's a big part of the issue. Now, we could try to reset with the Russians, and hopefully that would kind of allow Russia to leave Ukraine alone. But I am not convinced, given the current leanings of Ukrainians towards aligning closer to Europe, that will help. What I can say is Yeltsin, I do a project with my political analysis course where we take archives of the dialogues between Shevardnadze, Bush I, Clinton, Yeltsin, the Polish, Czechs, and Hungarian leaders between 1995 and 2000. And we look at what's in there to see whether the Russian leaders ever said, hey, NATO expansion's okay. And interestingly, contrary to what Sartori says in that book, her book, Not 1 Inch, her title's kind of a distortion of reality. The Not 1 Inch was referring to not violating combat troop levels based on the conventional forces in Europe talks of the 1980s. Up until Putin invaded the Donbass, or no, I'm sorry, Crimea, NATO never placed combat troops any further east than the former East German, West German line. All the NATO things expanded eastward for training centers and think tanks. Now, leave aside that the Polish troops, the Czechoslovak troops, or Czech and Slovak troops, Hungarian troops had combat capabilities that did alter that change of balance. So there's a kind of a word issue going on there. However, there is indication in the archives that Yeltsin said, hey, you can do this, but you can expand, but do it slowly. And two, if you're doing it, be aware that there are politicians in Russia who don't want NATO to expand. So all those things being said, we can't ultimately blame NATO expansion for this problem. I think I've written that in other articles. That said, it wouldn't matter if NATO expanded eastward, because NATO had the intent of being a political alliance. It only became military when the EU failed and UN failed in the Balkans. But it really becomes a military alliance again, really firmly military alliance, when the invasion of Ukraine happened, when Russia takes Crimea in 2014. But what prompted that to occur, the Russian taking Crimea? And this always galled me, because I wanted peace between Russia and the world, all the countries of the world. But inherent in everything that went on between 1991 and 2022, the Russians had this paranoia, almost structurally built in, that anything that moving westward, or from their side moving eastward, anything from their side moving westward, was a threat, some existential threat to their borders. And that's a historical myth that has to be overcome. But what really is the issue is the leader created the conflict. There may have been the fear, but it takes a leader to mobilize that fear and then mobilize thousands and millions of people to actually fight in it. So that was a long dissertation or monologue on that NATO expansion problem. But let me go back to something you said earlier, which I really kind of thought about this over the week when down in Washington, is America, what makes an ethnic group? Well, common religion, a common language, a common history. Well, I can think of the English and Americans in the 1700s had all of those. So by all accounts, if we were to go by 18th century standards, we should still be part of England.
Sure.
But we said we're sovereign. And the English later recognized it. Now, let's look at Canada, US. The Canadians and we as Americans have a lot in common. Now, leave out that War of 1812 overtime to try to take Canada, or parts of Canada, or Trump's recent moves to say, hey, we need to get part of Canada brought to the US. We recognize Canadian will to they want to be their own country. So Russia has no reason or no good justification to say, hey, Ukraine, we speak a common language, we have a common religion. Therefore, they should be part of us. It's totally absurd. It's just an absurd thing. The people decide that. On your other question about, are we seeing a new era, Victor? I was joking with one of my students this week about mood swings in politics. And there's a great movie that I recommend to any political science person or who is interested in politics. It's The American President with Michael Douglas and Annette Bening. Michael Douglas is the president, and Annette Bening's a lobbyist. Michael Douglas is trying to get reelected. Michael J. Fox, I think, is a speechwriter, and then there's this pollster, and they're at a Christmas party. And Michael J. Fox says, what explains the current switch from the president being 10 points ahead to only being 5 points ahead? And the pollster, who is a PhD in mathematics, says, the country has mood swings. Well, when it comes to our foreign policy, this is almost a predictable mood swing of we don't want to get involved in other countries' affairs. And I don't think we got as far as saying might makes right. We're just saying it's not our problem. And what happens in Ukraine is not our problem because we're not threatened by it. it's kind of the remnants of the Vietnam syndrome. And we go through that mood swing. I think after World War II, definitely after World War I, we did not want to get involved anywhere except work in our own backyard. We did want to get involved in Europe. It took major events to say you need to get involved because you have not only a moral responsibility to protect other peoples, but really you're the one in your own just geostrategic interests that needs to counter the aggression. Be it Hitler, be it Tojo, you need to counter the aggression because not only is it going to be a threat to human rights wherever Tojo occupies, wherever Hitler occupied, it'll also be a geostrategic threat to access to markets, access to trade routes, access to resources, and then even with the occupation, the consequent refugee flows that come out. And as much as we welcome people from all countries with open arms, even in our best days, we were not real happy about a lot of refugees coming all at once. I mean, I remember the Cuban boat lift back in the late 1970s. They ended up in middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, where I was growing up, and it was nice to have them around for a few weeks, and then just like fish, they go bad after a few days, right? So, any other thought? I'm sorry, Victor.
Yeah. Oh, many, but I have a question here. Is Dr. Deutsch, please, Leonard?
Okay. In the first decade of this century, I know some individuals who served as monitors or observers during elections in Ukraine. I believe they did it under the auspices of the United Nations. What role, if any, do you see the UN playing in helping to resolve this issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah, Dr. Deutsch, that's a wonderful question. And as part of a survey I'm running right now, one of the questions involves what if we were to put UN or OSCE observers in to monitor the peace? OSCE was in there right before the 2022 invasion. I think they went in 2014. And the Ukrainians' complaint against the OSCE was that they did nothing. They were observers. So their rules of engagement were very limited, and their influence back was very limited within the OSCE Council itself. If you're reading the OSCE documents, you can see that the OSCE non-Russian members would complain about Russian violations of at that point called the Minsk agreements. And Russia would say, oh, this is just a bunch of malarkey, or they talk about Ukrainian violations of the Minsk agreements. Could we establish a peace? I would say, is it peacemaking or peacekeeping force in between Russia and Ukraine, or demilitarize Donetsk? In other words, turn it into the DMZ between the two, like a no man's land, like somewhere between the two sides of the Berlin Wall. Like that Berlin Wall had like a big gap in the middle. As a no man's land between the east side and the west side. That's not a stable peace in the long term. And I'll be very cynical. I believe we've got to swallow the hard pill that whatever line gets drawn at the end of this fight is going to be the new Berlin Wall for the rest of our lifetimes, and maybe part of our children's lifetimes. We just have to recognize that part. We are in Cold War II, and I've argued for a while. We've been in Cold War II since 2008 at the Munich Security Conference, when Putin said, "You guys have offended us far too much. We're out of here. You are now our enemy." And you can see that in the military doctrine, even starting in 2004. So we just didn't realize that we were too thinking that Russia was, I think, in the words of Al Gore or somebody else, the world's largest gas station. It's a horrible way to denigrate. It's horrible to denigrate them and not respect them the way, one, they should have been respected as a nuclear power and as a fellow country within the world. But two, what they expected when Gorbachev and Shevardnadze moved to that new world order where we'd all live under the charter of the UN and the guidelines and norms of the UN. So in some ways we dug our own hole, but we also have a leader there now in Russia that wants to help us dig that hole deeper. So did I answer your question, Dr. Deutsch?
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah.
That was a long answer to like the UN won't help.
US is definitely not helping even by doing what League of Nations did, expelling its members for aggression. Weak and long gone League of Nations. Anara, please.
Thank you very much for your insights. You know, I think that situation should be a little bit different these days. I listened to different analysts on Ukrainian, Russian, European, and American sides, and president is Putin is totally different. Now he is seen as liability, and there might be scenario what happened after Stalin, after Brezhnev. They actually a transitional team may rush, and of course all of them might be interested in Western help, and that's why the scenarios for Ukraine might be totally different. So that's why I think we don't consider, because increasingly there are more and more signs that Putin is actually could be removed not by some outsiders or some popular movement. It's likely that his actually co-workers, how it happened in case of Stalin, in case of Brezhnev. Actually, it's a typical scenario because of that when we see domination of KGB or FSB. So that's a likely scenario. And I remember when I was in Moscow, when Brezhnev suddenly died, and I was in library of named after Lenin, and we were told not to come to windows because the windows were looking at this Kremlin. Anyway, I actually tried to see what is happening, and I saw a lot of troops. Troops were moved and surrounded Kremlin. And in this way, actually, Andropov was able to seize power, I suspect. We don't know the full history. And that's why there's a typical scenario for the actually replacing another weak leader. And that's and this situation, we may consider what might be beneficial for Ukraine in terms of negotiating the end of the war. And as I mentioned, the new comers would be very interested in Western aid in order to restore somehow economy. So that's what do you think about this scenarios?
And Laura, I think that's actually, I remember we always would talk about in internal Soviet, and I applied to internal Russian affairs. There's a triad of power made up of the party, the military, and the intelligence services. And the three kind of, after Stalin agreed, they would work together to make sure that no cult of personality came to power. So on the Brezhnev thing, I find it kind of funny that you tell me the story about the Soviet troops surrounding the Kremlin and Andropov kind of going in there to remove Brezhnev. I've heard stories, and I consider the sources legitimate, that Brezhnev in his last few years was actually senile. And he would walk around the Kremlin talking about nuking America on a routine basis. And it got to the point that if you look at later pictures at the May Day parades, he's being held up, literally being held up in person, or he may not be present. When I was doing my dissertation research about the Solidarity crisis and Russian or Soviet aid to Poland, Brezhnev did not come to the meetings. It was Andropov, Bulgakov, and Holy Crow, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gromyko. But Brezhnev did not come. I thought, oh, maybe it's because the Soviets didn't deem Jaruzelski and Konin, I believe, I forget the Polish president's name, as being worthy of a Soviet president. But I really think it was because Brezhnev was not right in his right mind. So I'm glad to hear that it may have been a coup and not just he caught a cold. When the invasion of Ukraine happened this time, I thought for sure the longer it endured, the more that triad would work against Putin. So like you said, that there are people within there that aren't really in favor of what Putin's doing, both because it's hurting the Russian economy, but by hurting the Russian economy, it's also weakening their poor oligarchic fur-lined pockets. And then the military itself, the military, and speaking as former military, no military wants to go to war. We go to war be under democracies with authoritarian governments because the governments tell us, go fight for us. The military, I'm sure, did not want to go into to be in there and kill their own brothers and their own sisters. I go back and think about Admiral Canaris in the German military, German Abwehr. He was very much opposed. We found out what Hitler was doing with Jews. He was done with Hitler. So was Rommel. So I imagine within the Russian military, there are people who say, hey, we've gone too far. Likewise, within the intelligence services, they know for a fact how backward Russia's become since the breakdown, I'd say since 2008. And why do they know? Because they go outside Russia and they travel around to see how good life is. And for example, right now, we're getting great news because of how nice Americans are during this World Cup. And I hear it time and time again. At last I was in a bar and some Brazilians said, I can't believe how nice Americans are. Can't believe that our hotel has air conditioning. So Russian intelligence officers see that stuff. And when they go home, they're thinking, what did we do wrong? And when you think about what led to Gorbachev or what prevented the coup on Gorbachev going successfully, it was KGB people who protested against the coup plotters. There's a division within the KGB. Likewise, within the military, there's a division within the military. So you're right. There are factions within all three parts of that triad. They're saying he's becoming a liability. Just like there are factions within the Republican Party saying Trump's a liability now. So to answer your question, yes, I agree with you, Nora.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that Ukraine may consider that it might actually it may request even more in case of the moment of weakness.
Well, yeah, and there's also eventually both sides, and this is kind of what I'm doing this survey, is the Russians too as people must be getting war weary. They're losing a lot of people. They're having their cities bombed. They too must be getting tired of war. So there are a lot of things lining up in favor of the war ending. I think my ultimate question, both here today and in the research I'm doing, is if the war were to end, what conditions would make peace last forever and not just 5 years or 10 years, but last for a generation? And like we have now between Germans and Poles, between us and the Canadians, although, like I said, we invaded Canada in 1812. So. And Mexico invaded us, we invaded Mexico. We invaded Mexico in the 1840s. I forgot.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. This is, of course, all very well, but I'm afraid, as an outsider and not an expert, I'm afraid that analogies do not work anymore in this world. I don't know if it's even pragmatic to talk about lasting peace. And talking about Germany, we don't have to remind our viewers that peace with Germany was achieved not how Vice President Vance thinks it was. It was not achieved through negotiations, unless you count Dresden bombing as negotiation or Hitler's suicide as another part of negotiation. It's not negotiation. This is something we hopefully will live to observe, the end of the regime, the end of not just a completely evil regime, but something which has not been seen even in Russian history. There was never, as far as I understand, there was never a period in Russian history other than last 20, 25 years when the country was ruled by a secret service, by FSB or former KGB, people who persecuted and hunted down for decades people whom I knew personally, people who basically worked clandestinely against this regime. And in this constant struggle for power in Soviet Union, this proverbial, as Winston Churchill said, dogfight under the carpet, we know that Secret Service emerged victorious after Yeltsin was gone, and treated the entire world through their elites, through their money, oil money and others, as their playground. So one warning that I keep hearing, that you cannot make peace with people who came to kill you, quoting Golda Meir. And definitely it's not a lasting peace with next, hopefully, group of people who want to buy you.
No, Victor, I agree. You can't, will never be peace if people want to fight. So, and
Well,
especially when you have a leader who wants.
But let's not forget, and most of my American friends don't know this. You mentioned military. I respect a military who protects themselves, like Ukrainian military. People who are not now dying at absolutely unprecedented rate. I don't know. As a military historian, you may correct me, but I don't think we have recorded military defeats, 1,000 people a day, anywhere in recent history. Maybe Romans and Babylonians would know differently, but we cannot trust their counts. So Putin's Russia loses in a month more people than Soviet Union lost in Afghanistan for 15 years. I think this was 15,000 people. They way surpassed American killed in Vietnam, of course, long time ago. And we all know that these people mostly are not conscripts. They didn't have draft. They didn't have military mobilization. These are contract army who signs the contract and gets paid and wants to get paid. 3 million rubles. I don't remember what it is at current exchange, but it's a lot. It's money which they or their families never will see otherwise. It's probably the first modern war when people's bodies and souls are bought in this cynical way. And we have heard many reports from the battlefield when their commanders sell their people and send them and declare them missing in action so that money will go to commanders rather than the families. And we have heard awful stories about the families and the scams around this, Black Widow scams. So I can list this stuff forever. The only thing I try to say no analogies are possible anymore. We entered not only period, as you correctly said, of war. I would not agree that this is a Cold War. It is not a Cold War for 1,300,000 dead and wounded Russians, and hopefully less Ukrainians, as we assume. So it's definitely not a Cold War. I would not agree that this war doesn't affect us. On this program, we heard literally dozens of people who tell us how it affects us. And above all, what you described as mood swings of a country seems to me rather dangerous. I don't think that commanders of the Second World War would approve of their descendants talking about mood swings somewhere in Iwo Jima or Hiroshima. This is not something, maybe it has something to do with TikTok and Facebook and YouTube, transparency or artificial intelligence, transparency of our world. You know, it created different kinds of people who do not care. Indeed, mood swings, as you said, from bottom to top, people who do not take the world seriously, who will sell their neighbor to the military in Russia. And we're seeing it every day on our screens. This is why many people around me, my friends, welcome the fires of Moscow today. And we hope not for just and lasting peace. I don't see this in the cards. I hope for surrender and victory, for military victory, for victory on battlefield, for something that our generation, or generation rather of our children and grandchildren who are fighting right now for Ukraine, would be proud of. It's not negotiable in other ways. It's not less negotiable than it was for 13 colonies who somehow did not negotiate with King George, or taking more analogies further, you don't negotiate with the Emperor Palatine.
No, Victor, I agree on many points. One, that whatever happens with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it does matter a great deal. Strategically, that matters a great deal, wholeheartedly, because if he were to be successful in Ukraine, Lithuania is next, Suwalki Gap is next. That then links us into NATO, and we're in big trouble. That's really an issue. On the mood swing issue, though, I would tend to say that it takes, when the economy goes down in America, we become more internally focused. It takes a major event to get us out of it. It took Pearl Harbor, and then the Pearl Harbor kind of lasted all the way up through Vietnam. And then we went into this period of isolation. And then it took really, I'd say we remained in a relative period of isolation. Now, granted, we were status quo within NATO, Warsaw Pact, but we didn't really leave that period of isolation until 1990, when we defended Iraq. And then we kind of went to another semi-period of reluctant involvement in the Balkans to try to stop the genocides there. But it took September 11th to say, hey, we really need to go out and start getting involved elsewhere in the world. So there's this idea that how much role should America play is a constant tension. And it's not a big swing, but it is within a tunnel where you can expect one president, for that matter, George Bush II, did not intend to be a foreign policy president. He intended to be a domestic policy president. September 11th changed that up for him. He became known as a foreign policy president. Did very little bit domestically. Obama, for the most part, he was more domestic focused. Although he had Iraq and Afghanistan to worry about. I don't agree with even that, but I don't agree with that. Luckily, I speak idealistically, Congress and the bureaucracy can constrain the whims of the presidents one way or the other, because there is a narrow band they operate within. So yeah, so I do agree that social media has kind of changed the nature of how people view the world. And for that matter, children, students. I see it every day.
To say the least.
Yeah.
To say the least. Anara, you have I see your hand, please. Anara? No more questions? Okay, we will thank.
I already
then,
had question. Sorry.
You asked your questions. Okay. Leslie, do you want to ask something?
Well, I mean, I put in the chat that beyond social media, there's also the cynical modern development of people being able to bet on war, along with everything else, which also further gamifies how people see the world.
Of course, this was always around. We just didn't see all this diversity. Yeah. So a diversification of the world. We will thank Mark Thomas, Dr. Thomas. Thank you very much for your insights. You have seen much more of this stuff in field conditions than we did. When I lived in Turkmenistan for 10 years, it was part of Soviet Union, and we thought it was peaceful time from the 70s and 80s. Of course, it was peaceful only few miles in to Soviet Union, and few miles out there was fighting in Afghanistan, where each of us could have been drafted at any point. So peace is always extremely fragile. It's always in the eye of the beholder. And I don't want to be cynical saying enjoy while it lasts, but people of the world need to prepare and do not start the fight if you think it will not come back to you. That's a stark warning. And I think that current events in Russia, specifically in Moscow, will move this balance in the way it should be moved, in the way of defeat of the aggressor and entering another world where aggressor is not being appeased.
Yeah, I share your sentiment, Victor. I would just rather us accept that peace is the norm and not as the exception to the rule. I know I'm an idealist, but nobody in their right mind should be wanting to go to war or remain in a war. It benefits nobody. I think it was John Lennon that said the only person that wins in war is death. Yeah. Yeah. So someday, Victor, someday.
Thank you very much, Mark. We will conclude our 225th weekly meeting of MUkraine discussion group at Marshall University. To our viewers, we see your sufferings. To our viewers in Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, Героям слава. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome, Victor. Have a good night.